সুপ্রিয় দর্শক, আপনাদের সবাইকে আমন্ত্রণ জানাচ্ছি ট্রান্সপারেন্সি ইন্টারন্যাশনাল বাংলাদেশ আয়োজিত জলবায়ু অভিযোজন অর্থায়নে সুশাসন বিষয়ক দক্ষিণ এশীয় বিতর্ক প্রতিযোগিতায়। এটি ফাইনাল বা সমাপনী পর্ব। এই বিতর্ক প্রতিযোগিতাটির আয়োজনের পেছনে একটি উদ্দেশ্য আছে। সেই উদ্দেশ্য বলবার আগে জানিয়ে দেই, জাতীয় রাউন্ডে 12টি বাংলাদেশি দল থেকে মোট 4টি দল সাউথ এশিয়া রাউন্ডে উত্তীর্ণ হয়েছিল এবং এখানে তারা নেপাল, ভুটান, শ্রীলঙ্কা এবং মালদ্বীপের সঙ্গে প্রতিযোগিতা করেছে এবং আজকে ফাইনালে মোট 4টি দল উত্তীর্ণ হয়েছে। এই 4টি দলকেই প্রথমে অভিনন্দন। জলবায়ু অভিযোজন অর্থায়নের বিষয়টি কেন গুরুত্বপূর্ণ এটি আপনাদেরকে জানিয়ে দেই। জলবায়ুর যে ক্ষতি হয়েছে, মানুষ তার বিভিন্ন কাজের মধ্যে দিয়ে জলবায়ুর যে ক্ষতি সাধন করেছে, এই ক্ষতি নিরূপণ এবং এই ক্ষতির বিরুদ্ধে কাজ করবার জন্য একটি বিশ্বব্যাপী ঐকমত্য প্রতিষ্ঠার প্রয়োজন আছে। তবে সবচাইতে ক্ষতিগ্রস্ত দেশগুলির মধ্যে দুর্ভাগ্যজনকভাবে বাংলাদেশ আছে এবং আজকের অংশগ্রহণকারী দেশগুলিও আছে। সেই কারণে ট্রান্সপারেন্সি ইন্টারন্যাশনাল বাংলাদেশ সকলকে সচেতন করা, বিশেষ করে তরুণদেরকে সচেতন করার জন্য এই বিতর্ক প্রতিযোগিতাটি আয়োজন করেছে। প্রথমেই পরিচয় করিয়ে দিই আজকের বিতর্কের অ্যাডজুডিকেটর বা বিচারকদের সঙ্গে। আমার হাতের সবচাইতে বামে দূরে বসে আছেন হাসান মাহমুদ বিপ্লব, তিনি সুপ্রিম কোর্টের অ্যাডভোকেট এবং একজন বিতর্ক সংগঠক। তার পাশেই আছেন আকিব ফারহান হোসেন, ব্র্যাক ইউনিভার্সিটির পক্ষে বিতর্ক করেছেন এবং বাংলাদেশকে সম্মান এনে দিয়েছেন আন্তর্জাতিক বিতর্কে। আমার ডান দিকে আছেন মাসিয়াত রাব্বানি, উনি ইউনিভার্সিটি অফ হংকং থেকে এসেছেন, এবং তার পাশে আছেন অর্ঘ্যদেব বিশ্বাস আরিয়ান, তিনি ঢাকা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ের ছাত্র এবং তিনিও একজন প্রথিতযশা বিতার্কিক। আমাদের আজকের অনুষ্ঠানে অতিথি হিসেবে উপস্থিত আছেন ডক্টর ইফতেখারুজ্জামান, এক্সিকিউটিভ ডিরেক্টর ট্রান্সপারেন্সি ইন্টারন্যাশনাল বাংলাদেশ। তার পাশেই আছেন প্রফেসর ডক্টর সুমাইয়া খায়ের, তিনি অ্যাডভাইজার এক্সিকিউটিভ ম্যানেজমেন্ট ট্রান্সপারেন্সি ইন্টারন্যাশনাল বাংলাদেশ, এবং তার পাশেই আছেন ট্রান্সপারেন্সি ইন্টারন্যাশনাল ট্রাস্টি, দীর্ঘ সময় বিতার্কিকদের বন্ধু জনাব অধ্যাপক ডক্টর মঞ্জুরুল ইসলাম। এই বিতর্কটি ইংরেজিতে অনুষ্ঠিত হবে, তাই বিতর্ক চলাকালীন আমরা ইংরেজিতে কথা বলবো। চলুন তাহলে দর্শক মণ্ডলী, বিতর্কটি শুরু করা যাক। Ladies and gentlemen, members of the House, I call this House to order. The motion proposed today to this House is that this House believes developed and developing countries have equal responsibility to ensure transparency, accountability, and integrity in climate finance governance. I request the opening government, Team Sri Lanka, to open their speech. From Team Sri Lanka, the speaker would be Shihara Nadishan Herat.
Honorable Speaker, sir, and members of the House, we cannot run against climate change with a limping leg. Ladies and gentlemen, when you take the issue of climate change finance governance, we see that there is a usual tendency where there are donor countries and there are receiver countries, ladies and gentlemen. And however, there have been recent opinions expressed that certain countries, maybe donor countries or receiving countries, must have a lesser responsibility than the other countries, ladies and gentlemen. However, we contend this issue and we strongly state that both of these countries, both developing and developed countries, share the same responsibility in terms of accountability, transparency, and integrity with relating to governing climate change finances, ladies and gentlemen. And firstly, as the Prime Minister of the House, I would be giving you the definitions of the motion. Secondly, I would be explaining to you what the problem is. And thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, I would be presenting the main arguments under our side. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, what are developed countries? We would like to define developed countries as countries which have a higher ranking in the Human Development Index, and developing countries have a lower ranking in the Human Development Index. And equal responsibility, ladies and gentlemen, we mean that we judge both developed countries and developing countries by the same standards of integrity, same standards of accountability, and same standards of transparency when it comes to climate change governance, ladies and gentlemen. In the same mechanisms we use against corruption, anti-corruption mechanisms, they would be held responsible, ladies and gentlemen. They cannot evade their responsibility by simply saying we are developing countries, so please, let us, there are a few corruptions which happen, but that's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on, we would also like to define the word transparency for being transparency in financial dealings when it comes to climate change projects for both mitigation and adaptation. Accountability, ladies and gentlemen, is vital in this debate because we mean accountability to the people, because we believe both these governments, whether it's developed or developing, are accountable to the people who elect them, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, we move on to explaining what the problem is, ladies and gentlemen. We see in the current modern context that many countries try to evade climate change by simply saying that, you know what, It is because of the developed countries that we are facing climate change today. Countries like Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, countries like the countries in Africa and the Pacific countries are saying due to developed countries' fault in carbon emissions, in greenhouse gases, we are now having a problem with our fisheries because ocean temperatures are rising. We are having problems with our agriculture because there is drought. We are having problems in our water resources, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that there is a principle called the polluter pay principle. Yes, developed countries must pay. That's not a problem. That's not contended at all, ladies and gentlemen. However, we believe that once this money comes into the climate fund, there is an equal responsibility between those who give and those who take to make sure that these funds are not used for corruptive practices, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to emphasize on that. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to draw an analogy for colonization, ladies and gentlemen. In the same way like climate change, we know in the world, colonization took place and people went under colonization. And we hold developed countries like the United Kingdom, Portugal, and Netherlands accountable for colonization, ladies and gentlemen. We can claim reparations, just like we claim polluters pay principle for the damages done for colonization, ladies and gentlemen. We can claim damages from those colonized countries, ladies and gentlemen. But however, we cannot allow those countries to say, okay, USA developed because of slavery, ladies and gentlemen. So Sri Lanka also needs to have slavery. United Kingdom developed because of slavery and human rights violations. So we need to also have human rights violations, ladies and gentlemen. In the same way, we cannot justify human rights violations. We cannot justify corrupt practices. We cannot justify mitigation of transparency, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to explain this in four major arguments. The first argument being that responsibility is a two-sided coin. Secondly, being that if these accountability measures are negated, it will be counterproductive. And thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, it will be a less incentive for countries to donate to the climate fund. And fourthly, ladies and gentlemen, that this is a slippery slope and it will infringe on other areas as well. Now, the first argument, that this being two sides of the same coin, ladies and gentlemen, we would firstly say that there is a donor responsibility, that the donating country's government has a responsibility to make sure that the climate fund or the money which they pass in their respective parliaments are actually used for climate change adaptation and mitigation projects, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because these are taxpayer money, ladies and gentlemen. They pass the money in their parliament which is given to them by the people. The people pay taxes directly and indirectly, and we believe in a democratic system the sovereignty lies in the people, and you must be accountable to the people and say to which country this money went to and to which projects this money was utilized for and for which kind of projects. Not now, sir. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, the receiver's responsibility. We also think that this money which the receiving countries get, let's say Bangladesh receives money for flood victims, Sri Lanka receives money for flood victims, India receives money for drought victims, ladies and gentlemen. It's given to them on trust, ladies and gentlemen, a trust for the people. And we believe that these countries must disclose 100% to which projects they use into, and they must minimize to an absolute level the room they have for corruption, ladies and gentlemen. Before I move on to my second argument.
Corruption, when it means using that money for personal gains or otherwise, is indefensible and probably out of this debate. Don't you think this debate is more about how these funds are used and whether we should give developing countries more leeway in terms of how they want to use those funds?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you give leverage to countries, it means you give more room for corruption, ladies and gentlemen. You give more opportunities for corruption. And we are not willing to do that, ladies and gentlemen, because my second argument says it's counterproductive. Why is it going to be counterproductive, ladies and gentlemen? Number one, if we take the climate fund and if these projects money go into developing countries, we see that in those countries they will not be used for the people who actually need it. It will be used for the politicians who want to get richer, ladies and gentlemen. You would just see tons and tons of money pumping into these countries, and the rich are just getting richer and the poor are just getting poorer, ladies and gentlemen. What's the use of pumping so much of money? And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, if you allow people to have a leverage and to, just go against the procedure of, making sure that it's really given, you end up building low-quality houses for flood victims, you end up building low-quality shelters for cyclone victims, so on and so forth, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to be counterproductive, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, I would like to conclude my speech saying I gave you what the problem is, and I gave you why this is counterproductive, and why these two parts of the coin. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we would urge the House to side with side government. Thank you.
Now it's time for the opening opposition to give their argument. I would request Team Nepal, Mr. Basant Padel, to speak.
Mr. Speaker, member of the House. Before I move on to the motion of this debate competition, I would like to recall the issue of climate change. How did it arrive? We say climate change is an anthropogenic climate change. It's not the natural climate change that we are talking about. It's the human-induced climate change that we are talking about, and we are focusing on the human-induced disasters impact. Human-induced climate change impacts, and its differentiated impacts between the countries. While talking about the shared responsibilities, equal responsibilities of the developed and developing countries, we should not forget that the climate change impacts as the differentiated impacts. Climate change has the differentiated impacts between the countries which has low income, which has already aggravated by the poverty, the development fluctuations. These are the issues that we couldn't forget. My Prime Minister has clearly spelled out that the issues of climate change in the poor and vulnerable countries. He agreed on the issues that climate change is a historical responsibilities of the developed countries because of their development process, because of the ill development practices that they have been practicing since long, because of the ill industrial revolution that they have been gone through. The poor countries, especially low-lying countries with low economy has been facing the abrupt impacts of climate change. Why can't we forget this statement? Why can't we blame those developed countries? Because we are facing big problem because of this. And also, while we say while we say the equal responsibility, we also need to look at the very article that has been mentioned in the United Nations Framework Conventions, which the 194 countries have signed in 1994 to deal with the climate change impacts. It was back in 24 years back. In that convention, it said that common but differentiated responsibilities with respective capacities. So this very principle clearly mentioned about the shared differentiated responsibilities. It's not equal responsibilities. The responsibility should be by the developed countries because of the respective capacities that it mentioned about that. So the developed countries have the higher responsibilities when it comes to the combating climate change. And also the issues of transparency, accountability, and integrity comes through the process. When we look at the Kyoto Protocol failure, we see that there are no any mechanisms of transparency. There are only MRV mechanisms. And because of that, the Kyoto Protocol failures. There is no any mechanism of transparency of the action and transparency of the support provided. So we need to focus on that part. The transparency of support provided by the developed countries has to be clearly disclosed. They have been aligning their financial support to the official development assistance, which is already there by the conventions. Yes, please, granted.
Sir, don't you agree?
Yeah.
When there is a developed country willing to give money to a developing country, if there is more room for corruption, more leverage for corruption, they would be less reluctant to donate.
No, I don't agree on that point. You are making an assumption that there is a room for corruption. You can't make an assumption when it comes to the climate change impacts, because it has impacts on the low-lying, poor economies, and that is the historical responsibility of the developed countries that needs to address this problem from their side by giving adequate financial support, technology transfer, and the capacity building of those countries who are already poor and vulnerable. That they needs to focus on that part. And also I want to mention this transparency and accountability and integrity issues that has been highly enshrined and spelled out in the historic Paris Agreement that has been adopted last year in 2 years back in 2015, which says that the Article 13 of the Paris Agreement says clearly about the transparency of action for support provided and also support received as well. So this clearly says something about there needs to be the support from the developed countries. It cannot be related to the issue of colonization. It cannot be related to the past development processes that the developed countries has gone through the socio-economic development practices. But it has to be related with the way they have been developing their nations. There have been the extraction of the massive resources, and because of that, there is a heavy pumping of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the countries which haven't pumped out any emissions. Let's say, for example, in the case of Nepal only emits 0.027% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and merely around 4% if you kick out the India from South Asian regions, these countries emit only 4% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. And why do you say there is a, and then why do you say that it's equal share of responsibilities? How can you say there? Also, climate change is related to the right to development issue. But what we are saying, the least developed countries and the countries who are at the transition economies are saying, we can learn from them, and we can learn in a way that our development process will be low carbon, climate resilient development process. But for that, their share of responsibility should be greater than the countries of those countries which have been already vulnerable due to climate change impacts. And also, I want to reiterate and I want to highlight on the issue that climate change issues is an ethical issues of when it comes to responsibilities. As also it has been already highlighted in the very convention that CBDRR responsibility, polluters pay responsibility, as you have been already mentioned in your statement that when it comes and combine and analyze those issues, we need to be very cautious when saying that there is an equal responsibility of transparency, accountability, and integrity when it comes to climate finance governance. But let's not forget that climate finance governance involves the flow of funding from developed countries to least developed countries so as to tackle climate change impacts in those countries, basically. So keeping on that mind, we should be focusing more on the greater responsibilities on the Annex 1 countries, developed countries, to tackle the climate change impacts across the nations, across the world, so as to safeguard the Mother Earth from destructive climate and catastrophic impacts of climate change. With this statement, I want to conclude my statement as developed countries has the more responsibility when it comes to the climate change combating issues, and when it comes to adaptation finance governance, when it comes to mitigation finance governance, and as overall climate change governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Basanta Padel. Now, the opening government shall speak again, and their representative will be Mohammad Sulaiman Ramiz.
A very, very, very warm evening to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. We can't run against climate change with a limping leg. Now, in the course of this speech, I'm going to prove to you why this motion should stand and why, if this motion is passed, the world would cripple. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do this through a three-stage analysis and then prove to you the latter two arguments of the government today. Now, what are we talking about in terms of analysis? Ladies and gentlemen, we first need to understand that the nature of climate change is such that it's a global phenomenon, right? It's connected and it's interlinked between all the countries, and all countries are interdependent in itself, whether it's economically, politically, or socially, right? And then we need to understand that through climate change, there are so many international impacts that affect each other. The best example I can give you is, for example, the United States has vested interest in the Middle East because of their big oil companies. So security is a major concern for them. In the same way, the US has interest in the South China Sea because they believe that the security of the South China Sea is important to them. So certain countries have vested interest, and we believe that because of this, climate change is an international phenomenon, as explained. The second thing we need to understand is that the nature of climate finance governance is important because of three reasons. One, it's urgent because we are talking about the loss of lives. Two, it's important because if it's not done properly, then people are going to die. And three, climate financing is limited because, as we define, climate financing is something over and above your ordinary development assistance. So we're not talking about a lot of funds to move around here, ladies and gentlemen. So we have explained to you on those three reasons, and we have also shown you that there is no funds to waste. Now, what are the three principles all our arguments are based on? Our first principle, ladies and gentlemen, is the principle of reciprocity, because we believe that international relations is based on mutual cooperation, and that is a 50-50, it's two sides of the coin. Our second principle, ladies and gentlemen, is that these governments have a social contract. The donors and the receivers both have a social contract in terms to the taxpayers and also to the people they're helping, because those funds are in those governments because of the people who need those funds, ladies and gentlemen. And our third principle is the concept of utilitarianism, where we're talking about the greater good for the greater people. Now, I'm going to give you a quick stakeholder analysis of exactly who is affected by this motion, ladies and gentlemen. I want to show to you the people who are waiting out there to see the results of this motion, whether it passes or fails. We're looking at three people. We're looking at the people of the world, we're looking at the people of the donor governments and the receiver governments, we're talking about the governments itself, and we're talking about the global community, ladies and gentlemen. In terms of the people, we're talking about taxpayers who give their hard-earned money with the intent that they would receive some benefit from it, where you have the governments giving those funds to other countries because of a certain historical responsibility. The second group of people are the governments who move around with each other, ladies and gentlemen. Here we need to understand that each government represents the interests of their own country, and thirdly, you have the global community where everyone is involved. Now, let me clarify two things at the outset of this debate. The two fundamental reasons given by side opposition as to why they don't have a shared responsibility is, number one, that developed countries are responsible for climate change. There is absolutely no argument there. We agree they are historically responsible, they emit carbon dioxide, brilliant, fantastic. The second reason is that they have bigger capacity. Yes, we agree they have bigger capacity, but this is a principal debate, ladies and gentlemen. What we are trying to say here is both sides have the same shared responsibility. They have an equal responsibility. They might have different capacities, but it means that they're giving 100% in the capacity they have. That's what the motion is about, ladies and gentlemen. So let me go on to the two arguments I have to deal with. The third argument, right, of side government is that it's going to create a very slow incentive for donor countries to give. Why are we saying this, ladies and gentlemen? Let me link this with the fourth argument. Well, what we're looking at here is a slippery slope. For an example, say that you pass this motion. You say, no, they don't have an equal responsibility to ensure transparency and accountability and integrity. What does this mean? That these governments are going to come forward and say, okay, fine, on the basis that the developed countries are responsible, on the basis that they have more capacity, we're not going to share equal responsibility. This would trickle down to human rights. This would trickle down to economic obligations. I mean, Iraq can come and say, look at the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United Kingdom and the United States. Why should we be responsible for human rights? You guys are more responsible for human rights because you all are the people who put us here in the first place. That is not what we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen. That is going to lead to absolute catastrophe. We need to understand this is two sides of the coin, and we need both governments to work in collaboration for the greater good of the greater people. Yes, sir. Very quickly, please.
When the average American income is round about 60 times the average Bangladeshi income, what responsibility do you think the average Bangladeshi has towards the environment, especially when it's not their problem?
Thank you very much, sir, for the question. I explained this in the first analysis itself. This is not about a Bangladesh and this is not about American. This is about the whole world, because climate change is not limited to the United States of America. It's not limited to Bangladesh. The effects of the apparel industry in Bangladesh is felt by the people in Europe because they export it to Europe, ladies and gentlemen. And there are poor people there are people who buy these, and it's absolutely interconnected. So this is not an individual-based argument we're talking about. So let me summarize what we have said so far. In order to counter the point of information you asked my speaker about leverage and how this debate is about giving more leverage to countries, let me talk about that. We first need to understand that this is not about leverage. This is about principle of whether developed and developing countries have an equal responsibility in ensuring climate finance governance in transparency and accountability. This is not about who's responsible. This is not about capacity. This is about everyone giving their 100%, right? Leverage, you don't need it. Why do you need leverage? Because so that countries can put their interests forward. That can be done through mutual discussion, right? But let me tell you this much. If this motion fails today, right, these countries they are trying to represent, the developing countries, are going to lose leverage. Because the primary reason for these donor communities to give them is because these countries are giving 100%. Because there is reciprocity. If they are giving a 50%, the other country is also giving a 50%. That is the primary incentive for these donors to give the funds, ladies and gentlemen. So in summary, what have we told you today, ladies and gentlemen? We have told you that the premise that the opposition based their argument, responsibility of climate change and the capacity of governments, does not stand, because this is not what we are talking about. We are talking about the principle of responsibility, equal responsibility. It's two sides of the coin. We have given to you 4 arguments. We have showed you how combating climate change is a two-sided coin. We have showed you how it's going to be counterproductive if this motion fails. We have shown to you how donors are going to have less incentive. And we have shown to you the slippery slope. We have shown to you how this is going to trickle down, how governments are going to use this as an excuse to be more corrupt, ladies and gentlemen. Because, I mean, think about this. Think about this. If you fail the motion today, what is the message you're sending out to the world? You're sending a message that it's okay for developing countries to not give 100%. That is the message you're sending out today. That it's okay for countries to go into corrupt practices. That is the message you're sending, ladies and gentlemen. Is that the message you want to send? Let's make sure that we fight climate change with 2 proper working legs. We don't want to work it with a broken limb. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the member from the opening opposition shall speak. She is Sizal Pukharel.
Thank you very much, opening government, for supporting the statement that proposed by the very opponent leader about the emphasizing about the differential responsibilities of the entire country. So I would like to put emphasis upon the scale of the differentiation of the developed country, developing country, or a transition economic country on the basis of the Human Asset Index, Economic Vulnerability Index, and gross national income, which cause them to fall under the least developed country. And there are almost 49 least developed country in the world. So the scale, the same scale which classified the entire country of the world into these groups, and that led this country to plead for the amount of money and then ask for the hierarchical high level of country for the fund. And on that fund, whose adaptation capacity, in fact, whose assurance of living or livelihood capacity is dependent. So when I talk about the very representative country of this least developed country, 5 out of 10 most extreme country, 5 out of 10 most extreme country, and that is a South Asian country, and whose economic loss is by 9%, and that is contributed by climate change impact, that is very near by 2050. So response to the climate change is not only urgent, it is indispensable if we are to assure about the human development need of poorest of the poor people living on those developing countries. So what is to be done? The entire government from everywhere should come together and accelerate the pace of the activities to shift the world to become more resilient. So we have already played the games of numbers in terms of losing of the lives, losing of the economy, losing of everything else, and now we are playing the games of numbers of money in trillions of dollars. And while playing the number of trillions of dollars, I would like to put emphasis on what that trillions of dollars means. It is a climate finance, and climate finance is very beautifully defined as a resource which is used to catalyze the climate smart transformation of developed trajectory by covering total cost of risks of climate action, creating an enabling environment, and building capacity in support of adaptation and mitigation. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to put emphasis on adaptation and mitigation and encouraging the, yes.
Since climate finance, by nature, is a global phenomenon, don't you think there should be global standards to it?
Definitely, I do support there is a global standard to it. But when you are to assess to those climate finance, and when you are assessing the climate finance, the standard, the fiduciary standard or social or economic standard do vary. And that is a tragedy of those gap between the developed and developing country. So again, I would like to put emphasis on the very consistency of the definition I just gave about the climate finance. And talking about those two inevitable pillars of climate change, that is adaptation and mitigation, which is in fact understood as common but differentiated responsibility, which even the opening government and the Honorable Prime Minister spotted that, and also a polluters pay principle. So common means all the countries, differentiated means definitely the share of responsibilities. So while we are talking about the global governance, the meta and microsystems comes here. And to the well functionalities of both the system of the governance, which entails about the process, decision, and outcome which sustains the natural resources, elevates the poverty, and improve the quality of life. But here, we are quite different than this and focusing more about the microstructure of the governance, about the climate finance, and it is a criteria to ensure the transparency, integration, and accountability in adaptation and mitigation project, which maintain the ethical and principal issues in funding by developed country. So, issues of principal issues and ethical. So, while we are responding to the climate change, there are two major inevitable things which I just talked. while mitigating. Most of the time, we just come on and check and balance about.
We have no problem with the polluters pay principle, where developed countries pay for developing countries. But don't you think you have failed to prove to this House as to why least developed countries are less accountable, should be less transparent when dealing with that money which is given from developed countries?
So we are not come to a conclusion that developing countries are less accountable. We are just debating on the gap between the developing country and developed country, putting these three integrated together, accountability and transparency together. So even while measuring the role of those developing countries in terms of mitigation, we don't just focus upon the very prime thing about that. Like while they scope the boundary of the greenhouse gas emission, this very phenomenon exists there. Do we really care about the scope of the boundary of the greenhouse gas emission during the measurement? Or do we also ensure about the calculation of the emission and measurement method about that and check the mandatory or voluntary contribution of the finance? So most of the time, the floor was moving toward the human right and slavery issue, the issue where people at least could survive. But we are talking about the issue that the people would very soon, maybe within the end of the century, when the temperature passes to 3 degrees Celsius, would die. Because I would like to reflect on the experiment done in Arizona about the biosphere too, which came to conclude that no one can engineer the life-supporting system that Earth provides us for free. So in a state of playing just the game of the numbers of trillions and billions of dollars, finding out the real responsibilities of both developed and developing country, and realizing the sheer responsibility in this whole climate politics would make sense and make it the world really beautiful place to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Alpokarel. Now we are halfway through the debate, and the debate moves to the lower bench. I'd request the closing government, IBA Dhaka University, to send their first speaker, Saurodeep Paul, to the podium.
A global problem requires a global solution, and that solution needs to be held at global standards. We recognize that in a lot of cases it is not practical to hold developed countries and developing countries to the same standards when it comes to transparency, accountability, and integrity. However, the very nature of climate change fund or financing is that it is unique of its own in that developing countries themselves had their terms to show to the world and get the funding in their own terms by negotiating it in a global accord. Which is to say that this climate funding is very unique. Why? Let's look at Paris Accord, or let's start from Kyoto Protocol. Since then, developing countries had formed their own caucuses in the forms of Pacific Islands, South Asian countries, or coastal African nations that have tried to negotiate with the developed countries into trying to get the funding, because developed countries, as already agreed in the upper house, has been historically responsible. What does this mean? This means that these countries have been trying to negotiate for the sources of funding, and finally, now in 2017, we have some hope, we have some sorts of funding, which is to say that the United Nations Global Climate Tackling Fund has been established, and we get that money. And the biggest donors are European Union and Japan, which is to say that we have, to a certain extent, achieved what we wanted to achieve, and we have gotten the amounts of funds that we require. The second step is the implementation of it and the nature of implementation, therefore. And that implementation requires us to maintain absolute amounts of transparency and integrity. Why? Because we have agreed in a global conference that we will indeed cut off our greenhouse emissions. We will indeed try for climate adaptation, which is to say that there are certain countries like Bangladesh who have agreed to a lower amount of greenhouse emissions cut than other countries, because those were the standards that were agreed upon. And those smaller standards that were agreed upon by these developing countries need to be met in a transparent manner, which is to say that we have a responsibility to show to the world how we are implementing that fund and in which way we are making progress. Otherwise, the problem is that firstly, because you as a country already in a global forum consented to the fact that you will be maintaining integrity, transparency, in that particular implementation of fund. If you do not do so, and if the standards are lower for your country, then that is morally abhorrent and a breaking of the promise that you have already made in a global forum. Which is to say that you as a country lose that credibility that you had in a global forum. Why is this so very important? Recently, as the United States of America has already pulled out of the climate fund, they were the second biggest donor, by the way, in the United Nations Climate Fund, and they pulled out. And they said that it's a waste of money that we are going forward with this fund and implementing things in the developing nations. The point at which you do not maintain transparency and you do not comply with the global standards or the things that were agreed upon in the climate conferences, even if that means that you're doing good things in your country, means that more countries other than the United States of America can go out there and claim that these funds are not being used appropriately. These funds are not being used the way that they should be, and these funds are being misappropriated in these particular nations. Why is this so important? This is very important because then finally we lose out on the bargaining chip that we already had. Because we already could play the card that, look, we have been in a situation where because of your developmental practices, we are in a situation where we are prone to cyclone and floods because of climate change. You lose out on that very bargaining chip, and you can now be accused that you're not maintaining transparency, you're not maintaining accountability. We further do not have any sort of responsibility to give you that particular fund. We think that particular nature of maintaining that accountability is so very essential in that particular case. Secondly, we think that maintaining accountability, transparency, and integrity in a global level is important so that people in the grassroots in developing countries get the benefits of that aid. Because let's agree on one thing. To a large extent, if you look at certain developing nations, like Rwanda, where there is some sorts of development, but the cronyism is so bad that a lot of the businesses are controlled by the political elite. And if you do not allow that sort of accountability and transparency to be maintained, what happens is that the climate change fund remains to that political elite and does not go further than that. Which is to say that only cities and only places where people of the particular dominating ethnicity or a particular group of people, such as the political elite, remain, development with regards to climate change stays only there and it goes no further. When you have accountability, transparency, and the fact that you're reaching out to global standards, and the fact that the aid itself is conditional, and you agree to those conditions, then there's a greater possibility that these funds go to the people in the grassroots, go to the people in the coastal areas, for example, to a large extent those people who have been otherized from the mainstream political narratives that have already existed in that particular country. At that particular point in time, if you maintain the sorts of accountability and transparency that is required, then and only then do these people get accepted. Thirdly, we think that it is not absolutely impractical to hold these developing countries to those standards. Because let's realize that Pacific nations, coastal African nations, and South Asian countries are the most vulnerable when it comes to climate change and the fact that they're vulnerable to other natural disasters. Which is to say that we think that to a large extent, corruption and other problems with regards to transparency are a result of moral decay. Which is to say that a lot of people who are implementing the funds think that we do not care about the development of the people and we might as well have money in our own pockets and get away with it. The very reason why this is the opportunity and this is not impractical to ask people to not do this in this particular regard is the very fact that these countries are so very vulnerable. Which is to say that my country's vulnerability and my country is dependent on this particular fund and the implementation of that particular fund. Otherwise, I will not have the sort of adaptation that is required in my own nation. I will not have that cyclone shelter. I will not have those flood breaking mechanisms that we have in this country. And that puts an existential threat to these particular people. And when there is existential threat, that is something that you can combat decaying morality with, and you can therefore utilize it to make sure that it's not impractical anymore to expect anti-corruption out of these people. And we think that it's very practical to expect that sort of transparency. We from Closing Government believe that because it's a global fight that we're fighting in terms of climate change, we need to be in the same standards, we need to be in the same playing field. We cannot play the card that we are poor anymore. We need to develop and we need to make sure that we are transparent and accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the first speaker from the closing opposition, Islamic University of Technology, Bangladesh, Mr. Sadaf Halim shall speak.
In having the unique privilege of being the arbitrators of what should be done with the same problem they've created, developing countries have had the opportunity to bias the situation in a way that has ensured that developing countries have little to no responsibility towards the climate change problem in itself. We think the entire Gov bench is trying to be really clever here in making this debate about corruption and not about in terms of the shared responsibilities and the extent of those responsibilities. They're trying to make this debate unwinnable. In terms of corruption, sure, we are always against corruption when it means that people are going to take that money, spend it on themselves, and never do anything for the climate. What we're not okay with, however, and this needs to be heard, is that these countries have legitimate reasons to not use climate change funding as it is given to them. That they have the ability to use them however they want in certain circumstances, and we think these circumstances prevail in the majority. We think the naivety of government bench shows. Let's assume, even in their best case scenario, that they're talking about a world in which proportional responsibility is a thing, right? So you only are as transparent as you are capable. But what this house doesn't realize is that developing countries simply are not capable of overlooking basic transparency. Things like overpopulation and things like extreme bureaucratic red tape within these own countries means that transparency assurance is a significant challenge in the same way it isn't in countries that are developed. This means bodies which have good intentions also have to opt into an already corrupt framework. That means institutions within these countries that are trying to do good things for the environment also have to opt into this corrupt framework. At the end of the day, even if this debate is about corruption and why corruption is bad, we tell you that these countries are facing a distinct challenge in that corruption is so intrinsic within these countries because of circumstances they are not always necessarily in control of. Things like poverty, which make people more prone to bribes. Things like not having jobs, which make people more prone to not caring about the environment. The absolute naivety of government in assuming that transparency is similarly easy to maintain, even if in proportion, is astounding. Because at the end of the day, these countries will always have a much higher difficulty in ensuring transparency, no matter what it is. We think that it's unfair to expect them to do anything. But we think, not now, we'll take it later. We think that most of these countries are not stupid, in that these countries know that they have a basic responsibility to show a veneer of progress to these countries. For instance, if funds are coming to you and if you don't show any level of progress, we tell you that most of these countries realize those funds will stop coming. At the point at which most countries do certain things, like build shelters, like put up cement bags in front of beaches so that the beaches don't really go into the water, we think those things will be done by these countries. But what do these countries generally do? At the point at which they have those funds, they prefer things like economic development to things like, investing in the climate. And we think that's something that's very important for these countries to consider. At the end of the day, if these countries aren't able to use those funds in those ways, it means harms that are never applicable to countries that are developed. Understand this. There are two types of ways in which emissions happen, right? Very basic understanding. There are luxury emissions and then there are survival emissions. At the end of the day, all of the emissions that come out of developing countries are emissions they generally do to survive, or at least for basic development which developed countries never need to do. That is to say that when a company in Gazipur is putting out waste into the air, it means it's making jobs which would ensure that people who wouldn't have jobs otherwise are having jobs now. We think it's a very basic difference from what companies like Chevron and BP are doing. That is drilling oil and causing pollution in a way that is unnecessary and gratuitous, frankly. Because at the end of the day, those are about things like profit, things that these countries aren't even considering at the moment. So we think the imbalance is extraordinarily clear, and we don't think there is any level of comparable transparency burden on these countries, because we think the amount of practices that are going on and the nature of those practices are completely different and therefore never warrant equal consideration at the end of the day. We'll have opening.
Say you have cancer and you have a coal. You're given 20% to the cancer and 80% to the coal. You're going to use all 100% on the coal and eventually die. That's what you're proposing today, is it?
That was a terrible analogy, but I will tell you this. At the end of the day, developing countries' ability to do anything about the climate is extraordinarily limited. If you are going to suggest that Bangladesh doing slightly more for the climate or Nepal doing slightly more for the climate is going to change the nature of our atmosphere and is going to do great things for the environment and will ensure the survival of the human race, that is absolutely a farcical thing to say, because at the end of the day, it depends on big companies drilling into the earth, taking away our resources and doing these things out of the need for capitalism and for profit. We think that the amount of impact that these countries have is almost always limited. To the extent that you're suggesting that if these countries wouldn't do it, the human race would be eventually wiped out, that's ridiculous, and we don't think that factors into this particular debate. We also think that certain practices that developed countries do always ensure that developing countries don't need to ensure transparency at the end of the day. Look at how much the cards are stacked against these countries. For instance, these countries have developed for 200 years after the Industrial Revolution with no need for any consideration about transparency and what happens to the environment. That sort of advantage has given them things like wealth, but more importantly, has given them things like advancements in green technology in itself, which has meant that these countries, which have destroyed the environment, now get to talk about being pioneers about changing the environment and also charging developing countries for a profit. We think that's absolutely ridiculous, because when Tesla makes solar panels and starts to sell them to countries that are underdeveloped, we think you're directly ripping them off for a problem that you yourself created. We think the principle doesn't exist at all. When companies that are within the developed countries go to developing countries because the regulations there are lower and then start to abuse those countries themselves, we further think that developing countries have zero responsibility to care about what happens, because it's at the end of the day we see that the fundamental problem lies with rich, wealthy countries abusing their privilege and then charging developing countries to care about the environment, even though the problem was created by themselves. We think for a wide host of reasons, even in the worst case scenario in which corruption is a reality and in which this might give developing countries more reason to be corrupt, we think it's still better. At the end of the day, for a developing country to impose regulations on its factories means increasing the price of factories and increasing the price of production of those factories. It endangers the lives of people. The comparative is not fair. The comparative does not exist. We think this debate is about the struggles of developing countries and how they don't bear any burden, even in the worst case. We're extremely proud to oppose. We think the opposition is extremely naive in the reality that these countries face. We don't think the two realities are comparable. Extremely proud to oppose.
And now the second speaker of the closing government, IBA Dhaka University, shall speak. She is Miat Mei Khaing.
Ladies and gentlemen, the reason why the entire opposition bench loses this debate is firstly because they fail to understand what this debate is about. We do understand it's about transparency, integrity, and accountability. But in what case? It's about climate finance governance. So as closing government, we feel the need to define what climate finance governance is, which the opening government didn't define in their case. It means for ensuring proper flow of climate finance, for promoting national interest, especially for the welfare of vulnerable population. That is a program that is aimed at helping ensure that climate financing decisions and actions are conducted with transparency, integrity, and accountability. However, another definition that comes here is equal responsibility, which means we're not contending about funds. We are contending about what you do with what you have and what you get as funds from other countries. That is, it is proportional to your capacity and responsibility. And when the opening opposition comes up and talks about differentiated responsibility, we tell you that we do understand that countries have different capacity, and we also recognize historical pollution, but we do tell that we talk about maximizing the capacity of individual countries and living up to that. Now, firstly, coming to what closing opposition comes up and says. Closing opposition comes up and says, look, corruption in developing countries is extremely intrinsic, right? And there is probably no way to get out of it. So what we do is we give in to this system and we let other countries, developed countries, take this burden. To understand, even if we're developing countries, we still have organizations like, say, Transparency International Bangladesh. We still have different NGOs who are fighting against it, right? And this is extremely important for a developing country to have such organizations or to have such programs which show that you are actively trying to combat corruption, right? Which helps you in your global image, which was further elaborated by Shorodev, and comes up and talks about how it gives us about a moral bargaining chip. But do understand, when closing opposition comes up and talks about survival, when closing opposition comes up and talks about how economic development versus environmental development, they do not understand that there are separate economic aids in the very first place. You have separate economic aids in the very first place given by different organizations. You still have UNICEF, you have WHO. But to understand these funds for environmental funds are specifically catering to climate change. The moment you're shifting this climate change funds to your economic aids, it shows that you're not living up to the consent that you have given in the very first place. That is hypocrisy in your position, right? Once you show that hypocrisy, once the international organizations see the hypocrisy that you're living up to, they will stop giving future fundings, which means it will automatically stop. So when you have future funding stopped flowing to your country, you know what? Guess what? You're not having economical development, you're not having environmental development as a whole. But do understand that this environmental aid is a global aid. It's given to different countries, almost all countries who are facing this climate change problem, right? Which means it has global standards, which means this is a responsibility that transcends your national barriers or borders, right? Which means this is a shared responsibility of all countries, which means there is more check and balance to see. As a result, you really do not want to, put on a bad image on your country as a whole. That ultimately says, when you use your climate change fund for only climate change, it gives you a better moral bargaining chip to begin with, right? Which means that organizations are seeing that you're actively doing something to combat corruption in your country and to do something about climate. But to understand, when you have environment funding, we tell you that environment development and economic development is not a black and white thing. It comes hand in hand, right? We tell you that we can still go for economic development when we are environmental friendly, which paints a better image, which means even when you have economic development, and as long as you do not have any sort of environmental friendly ways, that economic development is usually not meant to be as successful as you meant it to be. Because even if you say that you are investing in economic funds, it means that there are going to be floods, that there are going to be cyclones. So even if you go up 5 steps further, it means you're going back 3 steps back, which means it's not as efficient as it is. So we tell you that it's better to keep the world and to keep these 2 separate funds different and to use them in that way, right? But do understand, when closing opposition comes up and talks about, we do not have the technology or so, to understand, for that technology, why don't you just shift to that particular technology or shift to environmental friendly ways? We are not talking about shifting to a new industry, right? We're not talking about rapid industrialization. We tell you can still shift to that particular new technology and be environmental friendly with the limited capacity that you have that helps you in the longer run. So what does the opening opposition come up and say? Opening opposition comes up and says, this is a human-induced climate change. They bring out numbers, they talk about historical data and whatnot. And they are trying to play the entire blame game. And something is terribly wrong with this entire blame game. What is this? Blame game means us versus them, us versus you, which means you're already just shifting this blame and whatnot, right? But do understand, when you have an us versus them, it means more polarization of opinions, right? It means when developed countries, when those particular population are willing to help you, certain people are going to be more polarized and more prone to the right wing, right? Which means they're going to doubt every action that you're taking back. But do understand, when you are going for an us versus them, and when you are convincing your people to not do anything, it means you're trying to slack off. When individuals slack off, it means that cumulatively, as a culture, collectively, you build a new culture of slacking off, right? You shift away from your responsibility. And when it becomes a culture, it becomes so hard to implement that particular change that you are trying to bring in the very first place, right? So what do we tell you? In our worst case scenario, even when we tell you about that we live up to our responsibility, we tell you that individual attempts can sum up to collective attempts which help in better implementation. In their case, no funds coming, even if funds do come in their best case scenario, we tell you there are more barriers to implementation, right? So what does the OG come and tell you? The OG come up and tell you, about colonization and debates on principle, but they don't talk about the moral bargaining chip, right? They don't talk about the grassroots levels, which my first speaker has come up and talked about, right? They do not define what climate finance governance is. They come up and talk about reciprocity. They come up and talk about responsibility, but we have further analyzed about further funding will be stopped in their case, and we have shown you how us versus them mentality is detrimental to the entire implementation of different fronts of different programs of climate change, which is why we tell you that we have shown a differentiation between the opposition and us, and finally with the opening government and us, which is why we tell you we take this debate home. Thank you.
Now the last speaker of today's debate shall speak. He is from IUT, Mr. Muhammad Ibn Inayat.
Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about negotiations, the government bench needs to understand that the developing nations are between an extremely hard place and a rock. Because the negotiations have been led by the developed nations, and the developing nations need the developed nations to give them funds. And in order to get funds, these developing nations are setting unrealistic goals for themselves according to the global perspective, because they cannot simply say that being 100% transparent, being 100% having 100% integrity in the developing nations is attainable. The reciprocity that they talk about is simply not the present and is simply not the status quo in these developing nations. We have given you examples of how these developing nations cannot afford an electric car made by Tesla, cannot simply use solar panels in place of natural gases. So whenever you set goals for yourself in utilizing the funds that you get from the climate finance governance, whenever you set 100% integrity goals on yourselves, what happens is you end up not meeting those goals. So the rhetoric that people like populist leaders like Trump, so the rhetoric like leaders of that sort from the developed world gets bolstered even more. Because since you have set unrealistic expectations from those underdeveloped or developing nations, you cannot meet those expectations. And since you do not care about the present situation, you do not care about the context that they are in, those goals do not get met, and they face more difficulties in getting the funds and in negotiating. That's the problem that we have been talking about. We tell you that the rhetoric about the global nature of the problem falls flat on their face when it's not really a global problem. It's a problem created by the developed world. And the developing world are in no position to take full responsibility of disbursing the funds. Why so? Because whenever you, even in an independent government body who looks after the environment, you have to still go through the structure of corruption that has been there in your countries. You have to still bribe some politicians in your parliament in order to get your bills or policies passed. Because these are not popular policies in developing nations. Because these policies come at a cost of rising the cost of consumer goods. These policies come at a cost of having the farmers concede to some policies that make agriculture more costly, right? So these are the things that South Asian people have to do, and these are the opportunity costs that they have to maintain. These are the costs of the environmental protection policies or the funds that you want to allocate, right? So when they don't want to have these sorts of policies, you have to do certain things. You have to bribe certain politicians which are to put forward policies which are vastly unpopular in the current political scenario. So in order to do that, when you bribe them and you get caught in bribing them because you maintain full transparency, people like Trump and the people in the developed nations will always have more incentive to cut away the funds that you have been given. We tell you that even when you have some amount of corruption, these governments in the developing nations have to do at least something, because they have to build the shelters, because they have to build the embankments. And that is what we want, Mr. Speaker, at least the minimum level of protection being given to the coastal people in terms of survival. But when you try to maintain a complete transparent system within the politically corrupt and within the structurally corrupt situation in the South Asian regions, you tend to lose, and you probably will lose all the funds that you get in doing that, right? So that was the problem. Yeah, second, lower house.
The problem of developing countries is that we depend on that global framework more. And if we do not abide by that global framework breaks apart, and we are the ones losing, not the developed nations.
Mr. Speaker, as I have just explained, that we are getting funds, and probably when we have independence on disbursing those funds, when we do not concede to all the responsibilities or equal responsibilities of maintaining transparency, we can have some sort of a leeway, and that leeway can ensure that we have the basic or minimum level of climate change governance or minimum level of survival protection for the people in the coastal areas. When you actually promise 100% transparency, when you promise 100% integrity, you tend to give away all of your systems, you tend to give away all of your problems to the world. And when you present all of those problems to the world, you tend to lose the funding even more, because that fuels into the rhetoric that blocks these sorts of fundings, right? We also tell you that the opening opposition, that the opening government tells us that we have to come as much, tells us about the equality of the thing and about the proportionality of the thing. We tell you that the very beginning, we have been contending on the principle that it's simply not proportional for these developing nations. That we have been telling you that these developing countries, have simply no capacity to maintain these sorts of transparency. We tell you that the people in those countries, the closing government came in and extended on the fact that they have been going through a moral problem, and the people are simply just corrupt. We have given you enough reasons as to why the people should be corrupt in those countries. We have given you are corrupt in those countries, and it's the basic reality. You cannot simply change the structure of those countries by bringing in funds or promising transparency from your part. You are a government environmental protection agency, and you have to work within the framework of your own government and of your own situation. And when you do not do that, when you try to fight the system that you are in, you will be probably completely shut off from the political situation. You will be probably shut off from the whole structure of maintaining the government protection. The basic principle that the closing government gives is that we agree that corruption is bad. We tell you that corruption is a necessary evil that we need to maintain in order to get the minimum amount of funds that we need in order to ensure survival for our coastal people, in order to ensure survival that these people need. The minimum amount of things that we can have can be had by conceding some amount of corruption. And we have also shown you why some levels of development will be there, and there are incentives for the government also to do so. We tell you that it is a necessary evil that we need to concede. Thank you very much.
With that, we come to the end of today's debate, but the results are yet to be given, and before that, we would listen to the honorable guests. I would request first to speak to us Dr. Iftikharuzzaman, Executive Director of Transparency International Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be very brief. It has been a privilege not to listen to the young debaters, but also to be able to organize this debate. As Transparency International Bangladesh has been trying to engage young generation in all its activities, and with particular reference to climate finance and climate finance governance. As I always, I'm not a debater. I have never been a debater, but as I always say, and I really strongly believe, that debate is a competition where there are no losers. Everybody wins. All those participants who spoke today and also in their earlier rounds, I am sure that they have learned much more than they have previously been able to, and I think this was a great opportunity. This was one of the main purposes of this debate for us. And as I have noticed, they have represented high standard of knowledge and information. In fact, in many ways, much more than I do represent. So I congratulate and welcome all of them. Just one point I would like to maybe bring to the attention of everybody here, which is in my understanding, in climate finance governance or adaptation finance governance, the narrative, there are no actually developed and developing countries, no donor and recipient countries. It's basically polluter countries and affected countries. So when you talk of equal responsibility, I think the emphasis on how transparently, accountably, both the categories of countries are discharging their responsibilities and commitments. With respect to polluter countries, very simply, you all know, are responsible for climate change, as some of the speakers have very rightly alluded to. These are human-induced changes, and they're responsible for it. And remember that they have made a commitment to the international community, to their own countries, that they will compensate for the climate change. It's not a question of development assistance. It's not a question of donations or grants. They have to compensate for it. So to what extent they are actually delivering on that commitment, that's something that, in terms of this discourse of today, to be able to ensure how accountably and transparently they are delivering. At the same time, I think as many speakers have also alluded to, with respect to developing countries or affected countries, they also have the responsibility to utilize the funds in a manner that they can demonstrate to the international community, to their own countries, to their own peoples, that they have the capacity to ensure that funds are used for those purposes for which these funds are generated and raised, so that the affected people are benefited. That's the crux of the whole issue. And that is what is possible to ensure once you use those funds accountably and with transparency and integrity. That's what is the crux of the whole issue. So I think the speakers have brought up all these issues. I just felt that it is important to reiterate this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Iftikharuzzzaman. Now I shall request Professor Dr. Sumaya Khair, Advisor Executive Management of Transparency International Bangladesh, to speak to us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been an immense pleasure to hear all the participants here, and I think one of the key purposes of Transparency International Bangladesh has been very, very successfully fulfilled. I think the initiative was all about bringing young South Asians together, because they're amongst the future generation who are most likely to suffer the severe consequences of climate change. And adaptation and mitigation measures will be the order of the day for them in particular. They have actually very successfully deliberated on very difficult issues of climate change, funding processes, adaptation measures, and I personally found the deliberations to be very intense, informed, and inspiring. But one thing I think that has clearly transpired from this debate is that climate change, and particularly climate change finance, is a very politically charged issue. And that is a reality I think no countries, whether they belong to the developed nations or the developing nations, can ignore. And having said that, it's also very important to understand the political economy that actually shape the issues surrounding climate change and climate finance governance. The debaters have also very rightly, I think, flagged the significance of having the political commitment to see our obligations through. Whether we belong to the developing nations or whether we are part of the developed nations, when we enter into an agreement, whether they're aspirational or soft international commitments, we are nonetheless obliged to comply. Of course, it is necessary to come to the table and build a consensus on what the standards should be like. And it is for the developed economies to actually get the consensus of the developing economies in sort of creating and developing those standards, whether they're realistic, whether they're useful, whether they're practical, whether they're time-bound. But wonderful experience, well done parties, congratulations.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Sumaya Khair. Now I request Professor Dr. Syed Manzurul Islam to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it has been my privilege to listen to very bright young minds coming up with extremely intelligent proposals about issues which the politicians could not solve. Climate change is such an issue. And it's not a fake news, as Mr. Trump would believe, that's circulated by liberal quarters in the world. It is a real threat to the existence of not only human beings, but to the environment of the whole universe. And as I listened to the deliberations on this issue today, particularly climate change and climate change adaptation and mitigation, I myself have been enormously enriched and informed. They have brought out many issues which I probably would not have taken notice of. That's the strength of a good debate. It discusses an issue from a number of angles and looks at the issue under different lenses. And each time they discuss an issue, the pros and cons, as a debate usually does, you see so many possibilities of approaching an issue. That really opens up ways of tackling any problem. The parliaments of these countries in South Asia probably are not as fortunate as the debate bodies are. The debate audiences are enriched by the very young minds who have no stake other than in the people, in their own future. And these are the two very important words we have learned today, how the young people are looking at the problems that are facing them, and these are real problems. And climate change mitigation is just a small way of addressing the issue. The issues are larger than our debate today. And one thing I believe that the Climate Change Adaptation Fund that the West is developing countries, as Iftikhar has suggested, the polluter nations are offering to the affected nations, is not an aid. It's not a donation. It's a compensation which is way less than the actual damage done to the environment by those polluters. So they should be accountable, and accountable not only for themselves or for their sins. I use this very loaded word, sin, because a sin is something from which you just cannot escape. You have to make atonement, and the West, the developing countries, the polluters, have to make these atonements in terms of everything they can do to mitigate the climate change. I congratulate the side which is winning today and the side which is not winning today, because as Sumaya said in a debate, or Iftikhar said, all the sides win. The issue wins. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Syed Manzoorul Islam. The results are in my hand. Before that, I would remind you of the motion today that was placed before the House. The motion was, this House believes that developed and developing countries have equal responsibility to ensure transparency, accountability, and integrity in climate finance governance. Both the sides debated well, and we really had been pleased with the debating skill and the speech of most of the debaters. And we found a lot of new information, and also we found emotional discharge from different sides of the House. And now we come to the result. Best speaker went to Sadaf Halim of Closing Opposition. I would declare the team who secured the fourth position in today's debate. The fourth team in today's debate is Opening Opposition, Nepal. And now there was a heated discussion between the judges about the second and third place. And the third place is secured by the Closing Government. The champion team is IUT, the Closing Opposition, and the runner-up team is the Opening Government. And why the judges have chosen the Closing Opposition? Because they had a good speech, and they could rightfully point out that the question of funding is not an important issue, rather than the question of sharing responsibility is the important issue, and whether this responsibility should be equal or not. And then they have rightfully pointed out that we can actually think of a world where there is no corruption, but the status quo is not like that. And there would be more corruption in the poorer side of the world. There would be more corruption in the undergoverned side of the world. And the improvement could be there, but this could not be the condition of sharing responsibility, whether you have more corruption or not. Rather, the condition of sharing responsibility should come to the side of the world who causes the destruction of the environment more than the others. So I congratulate the Closing Opposition for becoming champions, and also congratulate Transparency International Bangladesh for organizing this beautiful debate, which would really enlighten the youth of the future. Now there would be an award-giving ceremony, and for that the judges would move forward.